What if the most radical idea in modern philosophy has been twisted into a slogan, reduced into memes, and misunderstood for more than a century? The word is Übermensch, Nietzsche's vision of the Overman, a new type of human being. When most people hear it, they think of arrogance, of domination, of a superhuman who crushes the weak. Sometimes it's even linked to fascist ideology, to Nazi propaganda, to the image of the cruel strong ruling over the powerless. But is that really what Nietzsche meant? Or have we been living under a shadow of distortion, mistaking one of philosophy's most daring visions for something it never was? Let's begin at the heart of Nietzsche's work. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he sets the stage with a challenge. Man is something that shall be overcome. Already, most people pause. What does it mean to overcome humanity? Doesn't that sound anti-human? But Nietzsche wasn't dismissing human life. He was saying, humanity, as it is now, is not the end. We are a bridge, not a final product. The Übermensch is the one who crosses the bridge, who dares to create meaning in a world where old meanings have collapsed. He is not a tyrant over others, but a creator over himself. Yet this is the first misunderstanding, that Nietzsche was talking about power in the political sense. In truth, he was speaking of power in the existential sense, the power to shape the values that shape your life. Why did Nietzsche think we needed the Übermensch at all? Because of what he called the death of God. For thousands of years, morality in the West had leaned on divine authority. Right and wrong were given meaning by the church, by scripture, by belief in a higher law. But Nietzsche saw cracks spreading through this structure. Science, secularism, and skepticism were eroding belief. The problem wasn't just that people were losing religion. It was that without God, morality seemed to lose its foundation. If there is no higher lawgiver, then who decides what is right? Nietzsche warned of a crisis, nihilism, a world where nothing matters, where values dissolve into emptiness. He didn't celebrate the death of God as liberation. He said it left us with a terrifying responsibility. Either we sink into despair, or we find the courage to create new meaning. The Übermensch is Nietzsche's answer to nihilism, not a ruler of others, but a creator of values. But why then has the Übermensch been so consistently misunderstood? One reason is the language itself. In English, Übermensch is usually translated as Superman. That word carries comic book images of caped heroes, or worse, racial fantasies of superiority. The Nazis seized on the term, twisting Nietzsche's philosophy into propaganda for their ideology of domination. They took Nietzsche's poetic challenge to overcome oneself and weaponized it into a justification for crushing others. But if you actually read Nietzsche, you find he despised nationalism, despised anti-Semitism, despised herd-like obedience to ideology. He even mocked the German nationalists of his time. The Nazi Superman has almost nothing to do with Nietzsche's Übermensch. But history, once stained, is hard to clean. To this day, people who have never opened Nietzsche's books still think Übermensch means the strong shall rule. It is one of the greatest distortions in modern thought. If the Übermensch is not a political ruler, then what is he? Nietzsche describes him not in definitions, but in images, parables, metaphors. Zarathustra says, I teach you the Übermensch. Man is something to be surpassed. What have you done to surpass him? Notice the language. It is not about surpassing other people. It is about surpassing oneself. It is about refusing to remain stagnant, refusing to cling to old certainties, daring to step into the unknown. The Übermensch is an artist of life, one who creates new values instead of inheriting them. He is the antidote to the last man, the comfortable, complacent figure who avoids risk, avoids greatness, avoids anything that might disturb his security. Nietzsche feared that without God, many would sink into the mediocrity of the last man. They would choose safety over challenge, comfort over courage, conformity over creativity. Against this shadow, the Übermensch blazes like fire. But here is another misunderstanding. Some think the Übermensch is an impossible ideal, a fantasy beyond reach. Nietzsche never meant him as a mythic hero that no human could become. He meant him as a possibility, a horizon we move toward, even if we never fully arrive. Think of it like evolution. Humanity is not the endpoint of nature, just as the Übermensch is not the endpoint of culture. He is a new form of being that emerges when old values collapse and new values are born. He is not above humanity in some biological sense, but ahead of humanity in the existential sense. He embodies the courage to create when all inherited meaning has died. To grasp why Nietzsche thought this was urgent, imagine living in a world where every moral certainty you were raised with has crumbled. Imagine seeing faith disintegrate, traditions questioned, old truths revealed as illusions. What happens then? For many, the result is despair. For Nietzsche, that despair is a gateway. The Übermensch is the one who does not retreat into old dogmas or sink into nihilism. He walks through the void and begins anew. This is not cruelty. It is creativity. Not domination, but transformation. Of course, Nietzsche's writing style makes misunderstanding easy. He does not write like an academic. He writes like a prophet, a poet, a hammer smashing idols. He uses exaggeration, irony, riddles. He hides meaning in metaphor. That is why it is dangerous to read him in fragments. A single sentence can sound monstrous if you miss the wider context. For example, when he praises the will to power, some assume he means political power, domination over the weak. But in Nietzsche's usage, the will to power is the deep drive of life itself. The desire not just to survive, but to expand, to grow, to overcome. Plants stretch toward light. Animals hunt and create territory. Humans invent, dream, create art. That is the will to power. The Übermensch is the one who lives this drive consciously, turning it into a force of creation rather than destruction. And yet, perhaps the most difficult part of Nietzsche's vision is this: he never fully defines the Übermensch. He offers images, stories, gestures toward the horizon. Maybe that is deliberate, because the moment you try to pin down the Übermensch in a rigid definition, you turn him into a doctrine, and Nietzsche hated doctrines. The Übermensch cannot be a checklist. He is the spirit of becoming itself. To misunderstand him as a fixed archetype is to betray the very fluidity Nietzsche intended. He is a challenge, not a conclusion. So where does this leave us? If Nietzsche's Übermensch is not the Nazi fantasy, not the superhero, not the tyrant, then what remains? What remains is a vision of human potential, a call to courage in a world without certainty, a demand that we stop living second-hand lives, dictated by inherited values, and dare to write our own script. The Übermensch is not a ruler over nations, but a ruler over the self. Not a destroyer of the weak, but a creator of meaning in the ruins of old gods. And this is where the misunderstanding matters most. Because if we keep thinking of the Übermensch as a brute, we miss the true radicalism of Nietzsche's vision. We miss the fact that he is calling each of us, not just a chosen few, to step beyond complacency. The Übermensch is not about creating a race of superior beings. It is about challenging each individual to become the author of their own life. But here is the problem. If the Übermensch is about creating new values, then what happens when those values collide? What if one person's self-created morality becomes destructive to others? Can Nietzsche's vision hold together in a world of billions, each writing their own script? This is the question we will wrestle with next. Because if Nietzsche gave us the challenge, he also left us with a paradox. How do you build a world where everyone is free to create without collapsing into chaos or tyranny? That is the riddle of the Übermensch, and the place where misunderstanding turns into real danger. When Nietzsche announced that man is something to be overcome, he gave us a challenge that sounds intoxicating in theory. But the moment we begin to live it, contradictions appear. Because if each individual is called to become the creator of their own values, then what happens when those values collide? If I declare my own morality, and you declare yours, what holds us together? Can a society built on self-created meaning avoid collapse into chaos? This is one of the most dangerous points of misunderstanding in Nietzsche's vision. For some, it becomes an excuse for selfishness, for cruelty, for dismissing others in the name of self-overcoming. But for Nietzsche, the paradox was far deeper. The Übermensch is not just about breaking old values. It is about the courage to live in the tension between individual creation and collective life. Think about the context in which Nietzsche was writing. 19th century Europe was a world of collapsing certainties. Christianity still dominated, but its authority was weakening. Science was unraveling the cosmos into indifferent forces. Darwin was showing us a natural world without divine plan. An industrial society was eroding old traditions. Nietzsche looked at this landscape and saw a dangerous future. Without God, morality could easily become fragmented. Without shared foundations, we risk either anarchy, everyone doing what they please, or new tyrannies, where people cling to authoritarian systems to avoid the terror of freedom. Nietzsche's work is an attempt to avoid both extremes. The Übermensch is not meant to be a sociopath, nor a tyrant. He is meant to be a creator who inspires, who embodies a new possibility of life, a horizon others might glimpse and strive toward. Yet the danger of misunderstanding is real. If you read Nietzsche superficially, it is easy to think, he's telling me to ignore everyone else and do whatever I want. That is not creation, that is indulgence. And Nietzsche despised indulgence just as much as he despised obedience. To see the distinction, we need to return to one of Nietzsche's most haunting concepts, the eternal recurrence. Imagine this thought experiment. What if you had to live your life over and over in exactly the same way for all eternity? Every decision, every mistake, every joy, every suffering repeated forever. Could you embrace it? Could you say yes to life without regret, without wishing it were otherwise? For Nietzsche, the Übermensch is the one who can affirm life at this level, not because he avoids pain, but because he transforms it. He says yes even to suffering, because suffering is part of creation, part of growth. This is a crucial correction to the common misunderstanding. The Übermensch is not a hedonist chasing pleasures, nor a cold ruler seeking dominance. He is someone who takes the weight of existence itself and turns it into a dance. He embraces life so fully that even the eternal return is not a curse, but a joy. But here's the paradox. If the Übermensch creates his own values, what about the rest of us? Do we all become Übermenschen? Or is this vision reserved for a rare few? Nietzsche's writings are torn between elitism and universality. Sometimes he speaks as if the Übermensch is a rare exception, a higher type that will rise above the herd. Other times he seems to call every individual to self-overcoming. How do we resolve this? One way is to see the Übermensch not as a literal figure, but as an archetype, a symbol of possibility. Not everyone will become one, but everyone can move in that direction. It is not a fixed status, but a continual process of transformation. In this sense, the Übermensch is less about hierarchy and more about trajectory. It is not about being above others. It is about being beyond oneself. Yet misunderstanding creeps in when we ignore this subtlety. History gives us examples of how dangerous the distortion can be. The Nazis, of course, seized on the idea of the Übermensch to justify a racial ideology of superiority. They twisted Nietzsche's language of overcoming into a justification for domination and genocide. But Nietzsche himself loathed nationalism. He despised racism. His sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, a fervent nationalist, played a large role in reshaping his legacy after his death, editing his unpublished notes into a book called The Will to Power that distorted his philosophy for political ends. This is one reason that Übermensch became associated with brutality and conquest. The misunderstanding was not accidental, was engineered, and it has haunted Nietzsche's name ever since. But even beyond political misuse, the Übermensch can be misunderstood in more personal ways. In the modern age, we often turn him into a self-help slogan. Be your best self, overcome your limits, live authentically. These aren't wrong, but they are watered down. They reduce Nietzsche's radical challenge into something safe, motivational, and marketable. The Übermensch is not about productivity hacks or lifestyle choices. He is about facing the abyss of nihilism and daring to create values in its wake. That is a far more terrifying and transformative demand than anything a motivational poster could capture. The misunderstanding here is not cruelty, but trivialization. So how do we live Nietzsche's vision without falling into distortion? The key is to see that the Übermensch is not a solitary island. Creation always occurs in dialogue with the world. The artist creates not in a void, but in conversation with an audience. The philosopher creates values not just for himself, but as a vision others might see and be inspired by. Nietzsche's Zarathustra comes down from the mountains to speak to the people, even if they do not understand him. This image matters. The Übermensch is not a recluse who withdraws from humanity. He is a figure who dares to bring new light into a dark world, even if that light blinds those still clinging to old certainties. His creation is for himself, yes, but it also radiates outward. Misunderstanding arises when we think creation means isolation. In truth, it means responsibility. Still, the paradox remains. If each person creates their own values, do we not risk conflict? What if one person's creation is another person's destruction? Nietzsche offers no easy solution. He was not interested in harmony. He believed conflict, tension, and struggle were inherent to life. But the difference lies in how we approach that struggle. The Übermensch does not destroy for the sake of destruction. He destroys only to create. He does not cling to resentment, does not blame others, does not wallow in victimhood. Instead, he transforms conflict into growth, suffering into strength. This is why Nietzsche placed such emphasis on overcoming resentment, the poison that corrodes the soul when we define ourselves only by what oppresses us. The Übermensch does not react to the world. He acts from his own overflowing creativity. That is the mark of true overcoming. This is perhaps where the greatest misunderstanding lies. The Übermensch is not a blueprint for society. He is not a political program. He is a challenge to the individual. And yet, individuals live in society. So the tension remains. How do we reconcile self-created values with shared life? Nietzsche never gives a final answer, perhaps because any final answer would betray the spirit of becoming. The Übermensch is not about closure, it is about opening. He leaves us with a question more than an answer. And that question is still burning today. Because look at the world around us. Old certainties are crumbling once again. Religion's hold is weaker than ever. Ideologies clash, and meaning feels fragmented. We face a new wave of nihilism, disconnection, cynicism, the sense that nothing really matters. In this context, Nietzsche's Übermensch is not a relic, it is a provocation. Can we, in our age of distraction and despair, dare to create meaning anew? Can we overcome not just the collapse of God, but the collapse of all the substitutes we've built, consumerism, nationalism, technological utopias? Or will we settle into the comfort of the last man, content with entertainment, consumption, and distraction? That is Nietzsche's question to us. And the misunderstandings of his vision make it even more urgent. Because if we misread him as a tyrant, we dismiss the challenge. If we misread him as a slogan, we dilute the challenge. Only if we see him as he truly intended, a call to courage in the face of nothingness, do we grasp the radical depth of his demand. But this leaves us on a knife's edge. Because if the Übermensch is not a tyrant and not a slogan, then what is he in practical terms? How does one begin to live as an Übermensch? What does it look like in daily life, in choices, in creation? Nietzsche gives us hints, fragments, provocations, but never a manual. Perhaps this was deliberate. Perhaps the Übermensch cannot be taught, only lived. And yet, we can piece together a path, an orientation, a way of being. That is where we turn next. Because the final question is not whether Nietzsche was misunderstood by history. It is whether we can live his vision today in our own fractured world. When we speak of the Übermensch, it is tempting to leave him as an abstract ideal, a lofty concept that hovers above us like a distant star. But Nietzsche was not a thinker of abstraction alone. His words burn because they are meant to be lived. So if the Übermensch is not a tyrant, not a self-help slogan, not a racial myth, then what is he here and now for us? What does it mean to walk the path of self-overcoming in a world that feels as uncertain as Nietzsche's own? To answer that, we need to descend from theory into practice, to translate Nietzsche's poetry into the rhythm of life. The first thing to recognize is that Nietzsche never intended the Übermensch to be given in a manual. He deliberately refused to lay down step-by-step instructions. Why? Because to do so would have betrayed the very spirit of self-creation. If he had written a 10 steps to becoming an Übermensch, it would have instantly turned into a new dogma, a new system to obey rather than transcend. The Übermensch is not about following rules. It is about breaking them, reforging them, and inventing them anew. And yet, we can extract a direction, a compass from his writings. We can find patterns of life that embody the spirit of self-overcoming without collapsing it into dogma. The first pattern is confrontation with nihilism. Nietzsche is uncompromising. Before you can create new values, you must stare into the abyss of meaninglessness without flinching. This is where most turn away. We avoid the terror of nothingness with distractions, with borrowed beliefs, with the comfort of collective illusions. But the Übermensch begins here, by stripping away illusions and facing the void. It is only when we accept that there is no pre-given meaning that we can begin to create. This step is painful, but it is also liberating. It clears the ground. Without destruction, there is no space for creation. The second pattern is the transformation of suffering. Nietzsche never promised happiness in the shallow sense. He mocked the pursuit of comfort as the goal of life. Instead, he called for amor fati, the love of one's fate. This means embracing life, not just in its joys, but in its agonies. The Übermensch does not resent suffering. He uses it as raw material for growth. Think of the artist who turns heartbreak into a symphony, the thinker who transforms despair into philosophy, the revolutionary who turns oppression into fire for change. This is not passive endurance. It is active transformation. It is the alchemy of the spirit. The third pattern is creative affirmation. To live as an Übermensch is to create not only art or philosophy, but values, visions, ways of being. This creation is not arbitrary whim. It is rooted in the affirmation of life itself. The Übermensch says yes to existence, not because it is easy, but because it is. He takes the eternal recurrence, the possibility of reliving every moment forever, and embraces it with joy. Creation, then, is not escape from reality. It is its deepest embrace. It is saying, "This is my life, my world, my fate, and I will dance with it." The fourth pattern is resistance to resentment. Nietzsche saw resentment as the great poison of the soul. When we define ourselves only in opposition to others, against the rich, against the powerful, against the oppressors, we trap ourselves in chains of reaction. The Übermensch refuses this prison. He is not blind to injustice, but he does not let it define him. He acts from overflowing strength, not from bitterness. His creation is not a reaction against others. It is an affirmation of himself. This is why Nietzsche warned against morality built on victimhood. True overcoming comes from strength, not resentment. The fifth pattern is solitude and return. The path of self-overcoming cannot avoid solitude. Zarathustra withdraws to the mountains. The creator must step outside the herd to find his own vision. But solitude is not the end. Zarathustra returns to speak, to share, to radiate. The Übermensch is not a hermit. He is a bridge. He endures solitude to bring new light into the world. This rhythm of solitude and return, retreat and creation, withdrawal and sharing, is essential. Without solitude, creation is impossible. Without return, creation is meaningless. These patterns do not form a system. They form a way of being. They show us how the Übermensch might be lived, not as a final destination, but as a continual process. Self-overcoming never ends. Each victory reveals a new challenge. Each creation demands new destruction. The Übermensch is always becoming, never complete. But here we reach a final difficulty. If the Übermensch is always becoming, always out of reach, then do we ever arrive? Or is he a horizon we chase, but never attain? Nietzsche himself was ambiguous. Sometimes he wrote as if the Übermensch was a rare future type of human, not yet realized. Other times he spoke as if the Übermensch was an inner possibility for each of us, here and now. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the Übermensch is both a distant figure and a daily practice. He is the ideal that guides us, and the process that transforms us. He is the horizon and the path. In this light, we can see why Nietzsche is so often misunderstood. To reduce the Übermensch to a tyrant is to miss his creative joy. To reduce him to a slogan is to miss his terrifying depth. The truth lies in the tension. The Übermensch is both danger and possibility, both abyss and affirmation. He calls us to risk, to create, to suffer, to transform. He is not safe. He is not easy. But perhaps that is why he matters. And so, the question, are we misunderstanding Nietzsche's Übermensch? Has a paradoxical answer. Yes, we misunderstand him constantly. But perhaps we must. Perhaps the Übermensch is meant to be misunderstood, to resist capture, to provoke endless reinterpretation. Each misunderstanding is itself a challenge to overcome, a step in the process of self-creation. In this sense, Nietzsche's vision is not a doctrine, but a dialogue between his words and our lives, between his abyss and our courage. The Übermensch, then, is not a solution. He is a provocation. He is not a final truth. He is a challenge to create truth. And maybe that is the most faithful way to understand him, not by defining him, but by living the struggle he embodies. Because in the end, Nietzsche was not calling us to admire a concept. He was calling us to become something new. Not tomorrow, not in some distant future, but here, in the choices we make, in the lives we live, in the courage we dare. The Übermensch is not waiting in the sky. He is waiting in us. The question is whether we will answer.